I said now, Tate, Mrs. Johnson repeated, more sharply while waiting for Tate in preschool to move back to his mat so Noah could sleep alone. Noah looked up uneasy. It's okay, I can move. No, Noah, Mrs. Johnson cut in, then back to Tate. You are not listening. This has been every day this week. You are refusing instructions. Tate finally lifted his head just enough to glance at her. I'm fine here. You are not fine here, she said, frustration breaking through her careful tone. You are disrupting nap time and you are ignoring every rule I give you. Tate buried his face back into Noah's chest without responding. Mrs. Johnson exhaled hard. Tate, if you do not move right now, I will send you to the principal's office. That got a reaction, but not the one she wanted. Tate only held on tighter. Noah shifted slightly. Mrs. Johnson, please, he's not trying to be bad, he doesn't sleep if I'm not here. That is not an excuse, she said, rubbing her forehead. This is not how school works. She crouched down again, trying to pull Tate gently by the shoulders. Come on, up, you can sit on your own mat and still rest. Tate resisted immediately, arms locking around Noah like a reflex. No, he said again, muffled, I'm staying. Mrs. Johnson's voice sharpened. Tate, this is your last warning. Silence spread across the classroom, other children shifting, some already half asleep, all of them sensing the tension. Noah looked up at her again. Can't he just stay close? He always calms down after a while. Mrs. Johnson hesitated, then shook her head. Not like this. She straightened. Tate, I'm calling your parents. That finally made Noah go still. Tate didn't argue, he just pressed his face deeper into Noah's chest, arms still wrapped tight as if the conversation was happening somewhere far away from him. Mrs. Johnson stepped back, already reaching for the classroom phone. And as the room slowly quieted again, Tate's breathing began to slow. Minutes passed. His grip softened slightly, not enough to let go, just enough to settle. Noah stayed still beneath him, one hand resting carefully on Tate's back, not pushing him away. Eventually, despite everything still unresolved, Tate's body gave in to exhaustion. His head stayed on Noah's little chest as his breathing evened out, falling into deep sleep like he always did, holding on as if Noah was the only thing keeping the world from slipping away. Mrs. Johnson didn't wait until the end of the day. As soon as nap time finally settled into uneasy silence, she stepped out into the hallway and made the call. Talia Blue speaking, came the voice on the other end. It's Mrs. Johnson, the teacher said tightly. I'm calling about Tate. He continues to refuse instructions during nap time, specifically involving another student, Noah. He will not stay on his own mat, he's disrupting the class daily, and today I had to escalate the situation. There was a pause on the line. Define escalate. He physically clings to Noah and refuses to separate, Mrs. Johnson replied. It's affecting the entire classroom routine. I'm concerned about dependence and honestly it's becoming disruptive. I understand, Talia said, her tone measured. But I want to be clear, before Noah, Tate had severe difficulty functioning in daycare. He couldn't sleep, couldn't regulate, and had significant anxiety. We were already monitoring that. Mrs. Johnson glanced back through the classroom window. Noah was sitting quietly in the corner now, playing with toy trucks while Tate slept on his mat, finally separated though still visibly restless even in sleep. I'm not seeing anxiety, Mrs. Johnson said. I'm seeing a child who refuses basic classroom structure. Yes, she confirmed. When I tried to move him, he became verbally defiant. That kind of behavior can spread quickly at this age. I understand your concern, Talia said carefully, but I need to emphasize context. Tate does not typically display aggression unless he feels threatened or overwhelmed. This sounds like a stress response. Well, Mrs. Johnson replied, her tone cooling, whether it's stress or not, I have to manage a classroom. If a child cannot follow instructions consistently, especially during structured rest time, it disrupts everyone else's ability to learn and rest. Talia was quiet for a moment before responding. He's improving in other areas. Mrs. Johnson hesitated. When he's with Noah, he's calmer, more engaged, less withdrawn, but that's exactly what worries me. I hear you, Talia said, but from what you're describing, he is functioning better, not worse. He is not functioning within classroom rules, Mrs. Johnson corrected. And today I had to make it clear that continued disruption may require alternative arrangements. That finally sharpened Talia's tone. Are you suggesting removal from the program? I'm saying, Mrs. Johnson replied firmly, that I will give Tate another chance. But if he cannot follow instructions consistently, especially during critical times like nap and transitions, we will need to discuss whether this setting is appropriate for him. There was a long silence on the line. Finally, Talia spoke more softly. I understand, I will speak with him. The call ended shortly after. Inside the classroom, Noah quietly pushed a toy truck across the floor, glancing up toward Tate's sleeping form once before looking away again, as the room stayed tense in that strange quiet that followed adult conversations children weren't meant to understand. On Monday afternoon, the classroom mats were laid out in neat rows again, one for each child, just as Mrs. Johnson had instructed. Everyone on your own mat, she said firmly, packing slowly between them. This is quiet rest time, no moving, no switching, understood? A few children nodded and settled quickly. Noah lay down near the middle, pulling his blanket up with little resistance. Tate hesitated. For a moment, he looked toward Noah's mat like he was deciding without words where he belonged. Tate, Mrs. Johnson said again, sharper this time, your mat over here. He didn't move right away. I spoke with your mother this morning, she added, watching him closely. We agreed you are going to follow classroom rules. That means staying on your own mat during rest time. That made him freeze. Noah turned his head slightly. It's okay, he whispered, unsure if it helped. But it didn't. Tate's face crumpled a little as he finally walked to his assigned mat. He sat down slowly as if the act itself weighed too much, then curled onto his side. Mrs. Johnson softened her tone slightly but stayed firm. You can be upset, that's okay, but you still have to stay where you are. Tate didn't answer. He pulled his blanket up and turned away from the room. Noah lay still, eyes open for a moment longer than usual. He could hear it, the small, uneven sounds of Tate struggling to settle, the kind of quiet distress that didn't fully stop even when no one was speaking to him. After a while, Noah closed his eyes, trying to rest but staying unusually still. The room remained quiet for the rest of the period, though the atmosphere felt heavier than usual. At dismissal, Mrs. Johnson stepped into the hallway and made another call. Talia Blue speaking. It's Mrs. Johnson again, the teacher said, voice controlled but clearly tired. I wanted to update you on today's nap period. Tate did comply with the instruction to stay on his own mat, but the transition was extremely difficult. There was a pause on the line. Define difficult. He became very upset when separated from Noah, Mrs. Johnson said carefully. He did eventually comply, but it took significant intervention and it disrupted the rest of the class emotionally as well. Several children were unsettled by it. Talia was quiet for a moment. Was there any aggression? No, Mrs. Johnson admitted. No physical aggression today, but the emotional reaction was intense and persistent. And Noah? Noah remained compliant, she replied. He did not encourage the behavior, but he also seemed aware of Tate's distress and distracted by it. Talia exhaled slowly on the other end. I appreciate you keeping me informed. I need to be honest, Mrs. Johnson continued. This is not just a discipline issue anymore, it's becoming a dependency pattern that affects classroom functioning. I understand your concern, Talia said, but I also need you to understand that Tate's baseline before Noah was significantly more dysregulated. We are still trying to balance stability with structure. Mrs. Johnson hesitated. I'm willing to continue supporting him, but we need consistency. If he cannot tolerate separation during structured time, we may need additional evaluation or support in place. There was another pause. Then Talia replied, let's set up a formal meeting. Teacher, parent, and school counselor, I think we need a coordinated plan rather than repeated daily escalation. Mrs. Johnson agreed after a moment. That would be appropriate. The call ended. Back in the classroom, the mats were already being rolled up. Noah quietly stacked the toys back into the bin while Tate sat on his mat, still and withdrawn, watching but not speaking, waiting for the next part of the routine to begin. At 2 in the afternoon, the nap mats were gone and the classroom had shifted into playtime. Plastic bins of blocks, toy trucks, and puzzle pieces were spread across the carpet, and most of the children quickly scattered into small, noisy clusters of activity. Noah had just started lining up a row of toy trucks when Tate appeared beside him. He didn't walk over like the others. He crawled fast, direct, as if there wasn't any space or distance he was willing to accept. The moment he reached Noah, he wrapped his arms around him tightly from behind, pressing his face into Noah's shoulder and refusing to let go. Noah blinked in surprise. "Tate, I'm just playing." Tate didn't answer. His grip only tightened, like the separation from nap time had left something unsettled in him that hadn't gone away yet. Mrs. Johnson looked up from her gratting and immediately noticed the shift. "Tate," she called firmly, "you need to give Noah space." Tate shook his head against Noah's shoulder. "No." Noah shifted slightly, trying to keep his balance while still holding a small truck in his hand. "It's okay, I can still play like this." "No, Noah," Mrs. Johnson interrupted, standing up now. "This is not appropriate. You both need space to interact with the class." Tate didn't move. If anything, he seemed to anchor himself more firmly to Noah, like letting go would undo something important. His small hands were locked around Noah's middle, his breathing uneven but steadying the longer he stayed close. Mrs. Johnson exhaled slowly, watching him for a moment before speaking again, more carefully this time. "Tate, you are safe. Noah is right there. You do not need to hold him like this." Tate's voice was muffled. "I do." That made Mrs. Johnson pause. Noah glanced back at her. "He gets like this after nap time," he said quietly, almost apologetic, "like he has to catch up." Mrs. Johnson studied them both for a long moment. The other children's voices faded into the background as she focused on the way Tate clung, not aggressively, not out of anger, but with a kind of urgency that didn't match the room around him. "It's like he's using Noah as an anchor," she muttered under her breath, more to herself than anyone else. Noah shifted carefully. "He's not trying to be bad." "I understand that," Mrs. Johnson said, her tone softening slightly but still firm. "But this level of attachment is interfering with his ability to function independently." Tate tightened his hold again at the word independently. "No," he said quietly, almost instinctively. Mrs. Johnson crouched down beside them. "Tate, look at me." After a moment, he lifted his head just enough to glance in her direction, but his arms stayed locked around Noah. "You can play with Noah," she said carefully, "but you cannot hold him the entire time. You need to sit beside him, not on him." Several of the nearby kids were giggling. Tate hesitated. Noah gently touched his arm. "It's okay, I'm not going anywhere." That seemed to land differently. Slowly, reluctantly, Tate loosened his grip just a little, but he didn't fully let go. Instead, he shifted so he was sitting pressed close to Noah's side, one hand still holding onto Noah's sleeve like a reminder. Mrs. Johnson watched them for a moment longer before sitting back down, shaking her head slightly as she returned to her gratting. And even as the rest of the classroom filled with the sounds of play, Tate stayed close to Noah, less like a classmate in a game, and more like someone afraid that if he let go completely, he might lose the only steady thing in the room. The parent-teacher counselor conference took place Tuesday evening in a small classroom with the lights softened and the chairs arranged in a loose circle. Tate was there but not sitting with the adults. He had been given a corner space with blocks and dolls to keep him occupied while the conversation happened. At first he tried to play quietly, but it didn't last long. A sharp clatter broke the quiet as a wooden block hit the wall, then another. "Tate," Mrs. Johnson said immediately, turning toward him, "blocks are for building, not throwing." Tate didn't look at her. He grabbed another piece and slammed it harder than the last. "Noah's not here," he said loudly, voice tense. "He's not here." His hands moved quickly after that, stacking, breaking, tossing pieces aside with growing frustration. Talia shifted slightly in her chair but didn't interrupt right away. Terrence watched Tate carefully, his expression tight but controlled. Mrs. Johnson lowered her voice. "We understand you're upset that Noah isn't here today, but we do not throw toys, that's not safe." Tate knocked over a tower he had just built, the pieces scattering across the carpet. "He should be here." Talia finally spoke gently. Tate, Noah is not part of this meeting. This is for the adults to talk about how to help you at school. Tate turned slightly toward her, still holding a doll. No, you don't get it. Mrs. Johnson exhaled slowly. We do understand that you are very attached to Noah. That's actually what we are here to discuss. Terrence leaned forward. We've been told there are concerns about how strongly Tate depends on one peer during the school day. He doesn't just depend, Mrs. Johnson said carefully. He struggles to regulate without him, particularly during rest time and transitions, and when separated we've seen increased emotional outbursts and refusal to follow instructions. Tate abruptly pulled the head off one of the small dolls and dropped it onto the floor. I don't care, he said sharply. I don't want to be by myself. Talia's tone stayed calm. Tate, we are not saying you have to be by yourself all the time. We are saying you need to be able to be at school safely, even when Noah is not next to you. Tate threw the doll's body across the floor, this time louder than before. Then bring him. Mrs. Johnson's voice firmed. Tate, stop throwing toys. Make me, Tate sneered. The room fell silent. Mrs. Johnson drew in a slow breath, refusing to match his defiance. Though disappointed, she remained calm. Tate, she said evenly, that's not how we speak to teachers. I expect better from you. Talia's cheeks burned with embarrassment. Tate, she exclaimed, stunned by his disrespect. You apologize to Mrs. Johnson right now. Terrence's expression turned cold and unyielding. He looked directly at his son, his voice low but unmistakably firm. That attitude ends now. You will apologize and you will do as Mrs. Johnson asked. For the first time since he had spoken, Tate's smug expression wavered as all three adults stood united, waiting to see whether he would obey or dig in even deeper. The incident happened during a parent-teacher meeting. Mrs. Johnson's voice firmed. Tate, stop throwing toys. Tate stuck out his tongue. Make me, if you can move me you can make me, bitch, he said defiantly, returning to stacking his blocks as though nothing had happened. The room fell into stunned silence. Mrs. Johnson blinked in disbelief before regaining her composure. Tate, that language is completely unacceptable, she said calmly but firmly. We'll continue this conversation after you've had a chance to calm down. Talia's face turned bright red with embarrassment. Tate, she exclaimed. Where on earth did you learn to say a word like that? Terrence looked equally horrified, his eyes widened as he stared at his son. We have never spoken like that around you, he said, shaking his head. I don't know where you picked that up, but we'll be having a very serious talk when we get home. Mrs. Johnson quietly reassured them. Children sometimes repeat words they've heard elsewhere without fully understanding what they mean. Right now, our priority is helping Tate learn that it's never okay to speak to anyone that way. The incident happened during a parent-teacher meeting. Mrs. Johnson's voice firmed. Tate, stop throwing toys. Tate stuck out his tongue. If you can move me, you can make me, bitch, he said defiantly, returning to stacking his blocks as though nothing had happened. The room fell into stunned silence. Mrs. Johnson blinked in disbelief before regaining her composure. Tate, that language is completely unacceptable, she said calmly but firmly. We'll continue this conversation after you've had a chance to calm down. Talia's face turned bright red with embarrassment. Tate, she exclaimed. Where on earth did you learn to say a word like that? Terrence looked equally horrified, his eyes widened as he stared at his son. We have never spoken like that around you, he said, shaking his head. I don't know where you picked that up, but we'll be having a very serious talk when we get home. Mrs. Johnson quietly reassured them. Children sometimes repeat words they've heard elsewhere without fully understanding what they mean. Right now, our priority is helping Tate learn that it's never okay to speak to anyone that way. Tate, Talia said firmly, apologize to Mrs. Johnson. Terrence nodded in agreement. Right now. Instead of answering, Tate folded his arms, stuck out his tongue once more, and blew a loud raspberry at his teacher. Talia covered her face in embarrassment, while Terrence let out a slow, frustrated sigh. Seeing that the situation was only escalating, Uncle Joey, who had accompanied Tate's parents to the parent-teacher meeting, quietly walked over to where Tate sat on the floor surrounded by wooden blocks. Without raising his voice, Joey lowered himself onto the carpet beside him and picked up one of the blocks. You know, Joey said gently, turning the block over in his hands, that kind of behavior and those words aren't acceptable. Mrs. Johnson was trying to help you, not upset you. Tate didn't answer, he stared at the floor. Joey gave him a reassuring pat on the shoulder. You're a good kid, Tate. Good kids make mistakes. What matters is what you do next. After a long moment, Tate's stubborn expression softened. I'm sorry, he mumbled. Then, seeking the comfort he always found with his uncle, Tate climbed into Joey's lap. Joey wrapped an arm around him and gave him a gentle squeeze before looking over at Mrs. Johnson. Thank you for apologizing, Mrs. Johnson said warmly. That took courage. Joey smiled down at Tate. See, that's the Tate I know. That's right, Uncle Joey said with a warm smile, giving Tate a quick kiss on the cheek. When you behave kindly and use respectful words, that makes your Uncle Joey very proud. Tate looked up at him. And if you keep making good choices, Joey continued with a grin, maybe we'll play airplane later and stop for some ice cream. Yay, Tate exclaimed, his bad mood melting away. Mrs. Johnson watched the exchange with quiet surprise. Throughout the meeting, Tate had ignored his parents' instructions and challenged their authority. Yet sitting beside Uncle Joey, he had calmed down almost immediately. Somehow, Joey had reached him in a way no one else in the room could. Joey gently bounced Tate on his lap, making soft airplane noises. Tate burst into delighted squeals and giggles, clinging to his uncle's shoulders. Mrs. Johnson couldn't help but smile. He certainly listens to you, she observed. Talia let out a weary sigh. We wish we knew your secret. Joey chuckled as Tate laughed in his lap. Sometimes, he said, a child just needs to know someone understands them before they're ready to listen. Tate continued bouncing happily on Joey's lap until Joey finally paused. Tate frowned and poked his uncle's thigh with one finger. Who told you could stop, he demanded, bounce me. A laugh escaped Joey despite himself. Yes sir, he teased, gently bouncing Tate again. Tate squealed with delight, wrapping his little arms around Joey's neck as the adults returned to the parent-teacher meeting and continued discussing the items on the agenda. From across the room, Talia couldn't help watching them. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Tate had challenged his parents, argued with his teacher, and refused every instruction they had given him. Yet with Joey, he was relaxed, affectionate, and surprisingly cooperative. She tilted her head thoughtfully. It wasn't that Joey was stricter than she and Terrence were. If anything, he was gentler. Somehow, Tate simply responded differently to his uncle, as though Joey possessed a quiet patience that made him feel safe enough to let his guard down. Even Mrs. Johnson noticed the remarkable change. I want Uncle Joey's ice cream, Tate said with a giggle, bouncing lightly on Joey's lap. I want my Uncle Joey to take me for ice cream on his red bike. In a few minutes, Joey replied, smiling as he kissed Tate gently on the temple. First, I need you to be a good little kid. Tate scrunched up his nose, trying not to laugh. No, he said between giggles, I wanna be naughty. Joey chuckled and gave him another gentle bounce. Being naughty doesn't earn ice cream. Tate laughed even harder, burying his face against Joey's shoulder as the adults smiled at the exchange before returning to their conversation. He didn't stop immediately, but Terrence raised his hand slightly in a calming gesture. Tate, Terrence said evenly, look at me for a second. Tate hesitated, breathing hard, then finally glanced over. I'm glad that you're being good right now, Tate, but back to the matter at hand, we hear that this is really hard for you, Terrence continued. But throwing things and breaking toys isn't going to bring Noah here, it just makes things more difficult for you. Tate looked away again, jaw tight. He's supposed to be here. Talia leaned forward slightly. Can you tell us what it feels like when Noah isn't with you? Tate hesitated for a long moment, still gripping a block. It's loud, he muttered. Everything feels wrong. Mrs. Johnson exchanged a glance with Terrence before speaking. That's important information, because right now what we're seeing is that school is becoming very difficult when there's separation. Terrence nodded. We may need to consider a support plan. Our intention is to help you feel more comfortable at school. This could include structured transitions, emotional regulation strategies, and gradual separation practice so you can eventually be okay, even when Noah isn't right next to you. Tate slammed the block down again, but not as hard this time. I don't want that. I understand you don't want it, Talia said gently. But we also need to make sure school is a place where you can feel okay even when things aren't exactly how you want them. Tate stood up suddenly, breathing unevenly. I don't feel okay without him. The room went quiet for a moment. Mrs. Johnson softened slightly but stayed firm. That's why we're talking with you. We're not trying to remove what you need. Our intention is to help you handle difficult moments so you can feel better at school. Tate didn't respond. He dropped back down into the corner, pulling a few blocks closer, but this time he didn't throw them again. The adults continued speaking in lower voices, discussing next steps, while Tate stayed in the corner, still tense, still upset but no longer escalating, just listening in fragments, as the meeting moved toward decisions meant to help him manage the gap between what he needed and what the classroom required. Mrs. Johnson rubbed her temple lightly before speaking again, her tone more tired than angry now. I'm going to be honest. We're reaching a point where we may need to consider a different classroom placement for Tate, or at least a structured separation plan. Talia looked up immediately. What does that mean exactly? It means, Mrs. Johnson said carefully, that when Tate is in the same space as Noah, his ability to follow classroom routines changes significantly. He struggles with transitions, especially during structured times like rest and group instruction. It affects not only him but the flow of the entire classroom. Terrence leaned forward slightly. Are you saying the peer relationship itself is the trigger? I'm saying the attachment is very intense, Mrs. Johnson replied. When Noah is present, Tate has a very difficult time engaging independently. When Noah is not present, we still see distress but less disruption to the group. Talia glanced toward the corner of the room. The earlier tension in the room had all but disappeared. Perched comfortably on Uncle Joey's lap, Tate had settled into the familiar rhythm of absent-mindedly fidgeting. One moment he was swinging his legs, the next he was stacking a pair of wooden blocks together before knocking them over again. Every few seconds he leaned back against Joey as if he had completely forgotten anyone else was in the room. The adults resumed discussing the parent-teacher meeting. Tate, meanwhile, had found something much more interesting to occupy himself with. Without saying a word, he reached up and wrapped his small hand around one of Joey's fingers. Even at the young age of 14, Uncle Joey was trying to tickle little 4-year-old Tate's ribs. Tate studied Joey's right finger with great seriousness for a moment, turning Joey's hand this way and that as though examining an unusual toy. Joey glanced down curiously. What are you up to? Tate didn't answer. Instead, he guided Joey's finger toward his mouth and gently slipped it between his lips. Joey blinked. What are you doing? He asked, trying not to smile. Tate looked up with complete innocence, his uncle's finger still in his mouth. He gave a thoughtful hum before answering around it. I'm sucking on your finger. My finger, Joey repeated, raising an eyebrow. Tate nodded as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. It's tasty. Joey couldn't help laughing. I hate to disappoint you, he said with a grin, but I don't think fingers are supposed to be on the menu. Tate giggled, still holding onto Joey's hand with both of his own as if he had no intention of letting go. The movement caught Talia's attention. She looked over just in time to see her son happily entertaining himself with Joey's finger. Tate, she said, unable to decide whether to laugh or scold him, what on earth are you doing now? Tate looked over at his mother without the slightest hint of embarrassment. I'm tasting Uncle Joey. Terrence let out an exasperated sigh while trying to suppress a smile. That sentence was not on my bingo card today. Joey chuckled and gently eased his finger out of Tate's mouth before the boy could accidentally bite down. All right, Joey said, laughing. That's enough, young man, my fingers aren't chew toys. Tate laughed so hard he nearly slid off Joey's lap. But they're tasty, he insisted between giggles. So you keep saying. Joey gave him a playful poke on the nose, making Tate squeal with laughter once again. Still smiling, Tate wrapped both arms around Joey's forearm instead, content just to hold on to it while the adults continued their meeting. Every now and then he'd glance up at his uncle with a mischievous grin, as if considering another prank, while Joey simply shook his head, amused by the preschooler's endless curiosity and energy. Uncle Joey chuckled as he tried to slide his finger back out. "Okay, buddy," he said with a laugh, "I think I've donated my finger long enough." Tate only grinned, keeping his lips stubbornly closed around it for another second. "Oh, is that how it's going to be?" Joey teased. Still giggling, Tate shook his head, refusing to let go. With a gentle laugh, Joey carefully coaxed Tate to open his mouth just enough to slip his finger free, making sure not to hurt him. "There we go." Joey held up his finger dramatically and inspected it. "Hugh," he said with an exaggerated sigh, "I thought for a second my little piranha was going to bite it off." Tate burst into laughter. "Chomp, chomp, chomp," he growled playfully, snapping his teeth together in the air and pretending to nip at Joey's hand. "Oh no," Joey laughed, pulling his hand back with mock alarm. "The piranha's on the loose." Tate squealed with delight, bouncing happily on Joey's lap as he continued making exaggerated chomping noises. "Chomp, chomp, chomp." Joey shook his head, smiling from ear to ear. "I'd better keep my fingers away from you for a little while." That only made Tate laugh harder, his playful chomping turning into uncontrollable giggles as the adults around them smiled at the silly exchange. Tate began to play with the blocks again, stacking them quickly and knocking them down just as fast. His movements were sharp, restless, not fully settling into play. A block hit the wall with a loud clack. "Tate," Mrs. Johnson said immediately, firm but controlled, "blocks are not for throwing." Tate didn't respond. He picked up another one. "Please stop," Talia said gently, turning toward him. "We need safe hands." Tate paused for a second, then stuck his tongue out briefly before continuing to stack the blocks again, harder this time. Mrs. Johnson let out a short breath. "This is what I'm talking about. It's not just one incident, it's a pattern of resistance when expectations are set." Terrence raised a hand slightly. "Let's slow down, he's clearly dysregulated right now." "I understand that," Mrs. Johnson replied. "But I also have 6 other children in the classroom who are being affected by this. They are at an age where they imitate behavior quickly. If one child repeatedly ignores rules, it becomes a classroom-wide issue." Talia stood up slightly. "Tate, stop throwing the blocks." Tate stopped, but only for a moment, then dropped them loudly instead of throwing them, the sound still sharp against the floor. Mrs. Johnson gestured toward him. "And I need to mention there was an incident last week where he kicked me during a redirection attempt." Terrence looked concerned now. "Was anyone injured?" "No," Mrs. Johnson said quickly, "but it reinforces the concern that when he feels overwhelmed, he reacts physically instead of responding to instruction." Talia exhaled slowly and sat back down. "Tate is not typically aggressive at home or in other settings, but I do hear what you're saying about regulation." Mrs. Johnson nodded. "That's why I'm suggesting we consider either a modified schedule, additional behavioral support, or a separate classroom environment where he can build independence without the constant presence of Noah as a stabilizer." Terrence looked between them. "We should also be careful not to frame this as punishment. If separation is used, it needs to be structured and therapeutic, not reactive." Talia nodded. "I agree. But I also don't want Tate to feel like he's being removed or rejected." From the corner, another block clattered softly instead of being thrown. Tate didn't look at them, but his voice carried anyway, small but sharp. "I don't want another class." The room went quiet for a moment. Mrs. Johnson softened slightly. "We're not trying to take anything away from you, we're trying to make sure school works for you and for everyone else in the room." Talia turned toward him. "Tate, we're going to help you, but you also have to help by listening when adults give instructions." Tate didn't answer. He just held a block in both hands now, no longer throwing it but not fully playing either. The conversation continued in lower voices after that, the adults discussing next steps, supports, observation periods, and possible classroom adjustments, while Tate stayed in the corner, quieter now, but still visibly unsettled as the meeting moved toward decisions none of them had fully settled on yet. The discussion in the room hadn't even fully settled when Tate's breathing changed again. He had been sitting in the corner with the blocks, quieter for a few minutes, but the tension in the room kept pressing in, voices still low, serious, repeating words like separation, placement, and support plan. Tate didn't fully understand all of it, but he understood enough. Noah wasn't part of it. And that felt wrong to him. The blocks in his hands suddenly scattered as he shoved them away harder than before. "No," he said loudly, standing up too fast. "No, no, no." Talia turned immediately. Tate stopped, safe hands. "I don't want another class," he shouted, voice cracking with frustration. "I want Noah." Mrs. Johnson stepped forward, calm but firm. "Tate, we hear you, but yelling and throwing things is not how we handle this." Tate kicked at a small pile of blocks this time, sending them skittering across the floor. "You don't listen," he said, voice rising. "You take him away." "That's not what's happening," Terrence said quickly, trying to keep his tone steady. "We're talking about how to help you feel okay at school." "I don't feel okay," Tate snapped back immediately. His hands were clenched now, his whole body tense. "It's wrong when he's not there." Talia took a slow breath, stepping a little closer but not touching him. "Tate, I need you to listen to me. You are safe here, but you cannot throw things or yell. That's not safe for you or anyone else." Tate shook his head hard. "I don't care." Mrs. Johnson exchanged a look with Terrence. "This is exactly the escalation pattern we're concerned about," she said quietly. "When he feels separation, he loses control of the room." Tate's voice rose again, sharper. "Stop talking about me like I'm not here." That made the room go still. Talia softened her voice immediately. "We are talking to you, Tate. We're not talking around you, we're trying to help you." Tate's chest was rising fast now. He looked between them, eyes wet with frustration but not crying yet. "I just want Noah," he said again, shorter this time but still tense. "I just want him." No one interrupted for a moment. Tate abruptly abandoned his blocks and spun toward his mother. "I want Noe," he screamed. "I want Noe, give me Noe, I'll keep screaming until I get what I want." His cries echoed through the room. Before anyone could react, Tate threw himself toward the wall, pounding against it in the middle of his tantrum. "Tate," Talia cried. Terrence was already moving, but Uncle Joey reached him first. Joey quickly stepped between Tate and the wall, gently but firmly guiding his nephew away before he could hurt himself. Tate struggled fiercely, his entire little body trembling with frustration. He kicked, twisted, and pushed against Joey's arms, crying so hard he could barely catch his breath. "Easy, buddy," Joey said, keeping his voice calm despite the chaos. "You're safe, I've got you." Tate continued kicking. Stop kicking me, kid," Joey said gently, adjusting his hold so Tate couldn't accidentally hurt himself or anyone else. The moment Tate recognized Joey's voice through his tears, something changed. The kicking stopped. The screaming faded into broken sobs. His tense little body immediately relaxed, and instead of fighting, Tate reached for his uncle, wrapping both arms tightly around Joey's neck. He buried his face against Joey's shoulder and began crying uncontrollably. "There you are," Joey whispered, rubbing slow circles across Tate's back. "I've got you, you're safe, take your time." Tate clung to him, still sobbing, his breaths uneven as Joey remained steady and patient, giving him a chance to calm down while Talia and Terrence watched with worried expressions from a few feet away. The room, which moments before had been filled with shouting, grew quiet except for the sound of Tate's tears as he slowly settled in his uncle's comforting embrace. Tate continued sobbing so hard he could barely get the words out. "I want him, I want Noe, please get me Noe." His cries broke Talia's heart. "Tate," she whispered helplessly, taking a step forward. Joey kept one arm securely around his nephew, gently rocking him back and forth in an effort to comfort him. "I'm here, buddy," he said softly. "You're safe, just keep breathing." Instead of settling, Tate's crying suddenly changed. His body stiffened in Joey's arms. "Joey," Talia said, alarm creeping into her voice. Joey immediately stopped rocking and looked down at Tate. "Tate." His nephew's arms and legs began to jerk in a way that was clearly different from the frantic movements of his tantrum. "Terrence," Joey said, his voice suddenly calm and focused. "I think he's having a seizure." Talia's face went pale. "Oh my God." Joey carefully lowered Tate to the floor onto his side, making sure the area around him was clear so he wouldn't strike nearby furniture or toys. He stayed beside him, speaking in a calm, reassuring voice even though Tate wasn't able to respond. "It's okay, buddy, I'm right here." Terrence immediately called for emergency medical assistance while Mrs. Johnson helped clear the room and kept the other children away. Joey remained at Tate's side, watching over him until help arrived, his hand resting gently on Tate's shoulder as he continued to reassure his frightened nephew. "You're not alone," Joey said quietly, "we're all here with you." Joey moved quickly and carefully, staying calm as he helped his nephew through it. When the seizure finally passed, Tate went limp with exhaustion, his eyes closing as he slipped into sleep. Joey gently rested Tate's head in his lap and brushed his nephew's hair back, quietly reassuring him even though Tate couldn't hear him. "It's okay," Joey murmured, "you're okay." Talia stood nearby, visibly upset, watching her son with a mother's fear and helplessness. Terrence remained frozen for a moment, unsure what to say or what he could do to make the situation better. The room that had been filled with conversation only minutes before was now completely silent, everyone focused on the little boy resting against Joey, waiting for him to wake up. 20 minutes later, Tate slowly opened his eyes. The exhaustion from the seizure still clung to him, and instead of returning to the others, the little boy quietly crawled behind the couch in the teacher's lounge, seeking somewhere hidden and safe. Unaware that he had slipped away, Talia and Terrence continued talking with the teachers about what had happened and how Tate's episodes had been affecting the preschool classroom. Joey noticed the empty space where Tate had been resting. He immediately looked around. "Tate!" A small movement behind the couch caught his attention. Joey crouched down and carefully reached behind it. "There you are," he said softly. Tate didn't answer, he only curled farther into his hiding place. Joey gently coaxed him out, careful not to frighten him, and lifted his nephew into his arms. He settled Tate onto his knee, keeping a steady hand on his back. "It's okay," Joey whispered, "you're safe." Across the room, Terrence looked over at his son. For a moment he simply watched. He saw how naturally Tate leaned into Joey, how quickly the little boy calmed when he was held by him. Terrence's expression softened, caught between concern for his son and gratitude that someone knew how to reach him when he was overwhelmed. Then Terrence spoke gently, "Tate, wanting someone you feel safe with is okay, but part of school is learning how to feel safe even when that person isn't right next to you." Tate shook his head again, but slower now. "I can't." Mrs. Johnson exhaled, "That's what we're trying to help you learn." For a long moment, Tate stood there, frozen between anger and something closer to overwhelm. Then he weakly turned back toward the blocks, not throwing them this time, but gripping one tightly in both hands like it was the only thing keeping him steady. The adults lowered their voices again, continuing the conversation more carefully while Tate stayed in the corner, still upset, but no longer escalating, just breathing hard, stuck in the feeling of everything changing without him being ready for it. Tate's frustration finally tipped over again. "I want Noe," he said, voice breaking as he turned away from the adults. "Bring me Noe." Talia immediately stepped closer. "Tate, I hear you, Noah isn't here right now, you are safe in this room." "That's not what I want," Tate shouted, dropping to the floor and rolling onto his side, kicking at the carpet in short bursts of overwhelmed energy. "No, no, no." Mrs. Johnson sighed quietly, not in judgment but in exhaustion. "We need to give him a moment to regulate." Terrence nodded. "Don't engage the escalation directly, just ensure safety." For a minute or two, Tate stayed like that, crying hard, kicking the floor, voice rising and falling in short bursts of protest. The room stayed still around him, the adults keeping a careful distance while he worked through the overwhelm in the only way he knew how. Then, just as suddenly as it had peaked, it began to fade. The kicking slowed, the crying quieted. Tate lay there for a moment, breathing hard, then slowly pushed himself up. He wiped at his face with his sleeve and crawled back toward the blocks without looking at anyone. He didn't speak. He just started stacking again, a little more carefully now, though his hands were still shaky. Mrs. Johnson watched him for a moment before speaking quietly. "This is what I'm talking about. The intensity of his response to separation is unlike anything I've seen in my classroom experience. Talia folded her hands together, her voice careful. Tate has always had difficulty with transitions and anxiety, but I want to understand what you're seeing specifically at school. Mrs. Johnson hesitated, then chose her words more gently. It's not just preference, it's distress. When Noah isn't present or accessible, he becomes significantly dysregulated. It affects his ability to function in group settings. Terrence leaned forward slightly. Have there been any major changes at home recently? Loss, separation, moves, anything that might explain an attachment response this strong? Talia shook her head. No recent deaths or separations. His home environment has been stable since our move to Los Angeles. This behavior became noticeable when he started forming a close bond with one specific peer. Mrs. Johnson nodded slowly. That's what concerns me. It's not typical for a child his age to rely so heavily on one peer for emotional regulation. Terrence considered this. It may still be an attachment or anxiety regulation issue rather than something situational. Sometimes children latch onto a peer as a consistent source of comfort in structured environments. Talia looked toward Tate again. He was quietly lining up blocks now, no longer crying but still visibly tense in the way he held himself. What would you recommend? She asked. Mrs. Johnson exhaled. At a minimum, a structured plan to build independence from Noah during the school day, gradual separation periods, consistent expectations, and possibly support from a school counselor during transitions. Terrence added, and we should avoid abrupt removals or punitive framing. The goal is regulation, not isolation. Talia nodded slowly. I want him to succeed here. I don't want him to feel punished for needing comfort. Mrs. Johnson softened slightly. That's not what this is, but right now his need is interfering with his ability to function in the classroom setting. From the corner, Tate quietly clicked 2 blocks together, listening in fragments as the adults continued talking, the room still heavy but no longer in crisis, just in the careful space between concern and trying to find a solution. Tate's frustration flared again, but it didn't hold the same sharp edge as before. He moved back to the blocks anyway, knocking a few together too hard against the wall before Talia stepped in closer. Tate, she said firmly but calmly, safe hands, no throwing. He didn't argue this time. His breathing was still uneven, but the intensity had started to shift, less outward explosion, more restless movement. For a moment he stood there gripping a block tightly, then suddenly dropped it and walked across the room. Talia straightened slightly. Tate. Instead of returning to the toys, he went straight to her and wrapped his arms around her leg. The movement wasn't aggressive or defiant now, it was fast, instinctive, like he needed contact more than anything else in the room. He held on tightly, pressing his face against her leg, body curled in close. Talia immediately softened. She placed a hand gently on the top of his head. Hey, she said quietly, I've got you. Tate didn't speak. He just stayed there holding on, his breathing slowly starting to even out as the physical contact grounded him. Mrs. Johnson watched the shift carefully from a few feet away. The classroom had gone quiet except for the soft sound of children continuing to play and the earlier tension still lingering in the adults' conversation. Terrence observed as well, his expression thoughtful rather than alarmed. That's a clear regulation-seeking behavior, he said quietly. Tate stayed wrapped around Talia's leg, his breathing slowly settling as her hand continued to rest gently on his head. For a few quiet moments he didn't say anything at all. The earlier intensity had drained out of him, leaving behind a kind of exhausted clinginess, like he needed something steady to hold onto while his emotions finished settling. A small whisper finally slipped out. Noe, he murmured, almost absent-mindedly, as if the name was still sitting heavily in his mind even while he was physically anchored somewhere else. Talia's hand paused for a second, then resumed its gentle motion. Noah's not here right now, she said softly, but you're safe with me. Tate didn't respond, but he tightened his hold on her leg slightly, as if acknowledging both things at once, what he wanted and what was actually there. Mrs. Johnson watched the moment carefully, her expression softening a little despite herself. Terrence spoke quietly beside her. He's still using that attachment as his primary emotional reference point. Mrs. Johnson nodded. Even when he's not with him, he's still thinking about him. Talia crouched a little more so she was closer to his level. Tate, can you take a slow breath with me? After a pause, he did, uneven at first, then a little steadier. That's it, she encouraged gently. You're okay, we're just going to sit for a minute. Tate stayed where he was, holding on, no longer throwing blocks or shouting, just quietly clinging to the comfort he had, even while still thinking about Noah in the background of his mind. Terrence smiled softly. There is my little boy, he said as he carefully picked Tate up and settled his son onto his lap. For a brief moment, he hoped that being with his father would help him feel safe. Instead, Tate immediately became overwhelmed. He began kicking and crying, his distress growing as he reached his arms toward Joey. Uncle Joey. Tate's voice rose into a desperate scream as he tried to reach for him. Terrence held on gently, confused by the intensity of his son's reaction. Tate, it's okay, he said. But Tate pushed away, trying to get back to Joey. In the struggle, he slipped from his father's lap and landed on the floor with a small clunk. The room went quiet. Tate continued crying as he crawled across the floor toward Joey, reaching for the person who had comforted him moments before. When he reached his uncle, he wrapped his arms tightly around Joey's legs and held on. Joey immediately bent down and placed a reassuring hand on Tate's back. I'm here, Joey said quietly. Terrence watched the two of them, his expression filled with concern. He loved his son, but he couldn't understand why Tate seemed to need Joey so intensely in moments when he was scared. The emotional outburst became too much for Tate. As Joey held him, Tate began shaking again, overwhelmed by the intensity of his distress. Terrence immediately moved closer and carefully picked up his son. It's your father, he whispered, holding him close. I'm right here. Tate slowly relaxed in his father's arms, exhausted from everything that had happened. His eyes closed as he slipped into an uneasy sleep against Terrence's chest. Joey watched quietly, his expression filled with concern. He gets like this when he becomes overwhelmed, Joey explained softly. Terrence looked down at his son, gently holding him. He hated seeing Tate go through moments like this, especially when all he wanted was to make him feel safe. Tate woke up a few minutes later, but he didn't wake up like a child who had simply finished a nap. The room felt different, quiet, tense, and uncertain. Mrs. Johnson, his preschool teacher, watched him closely. In all her years working with children, she had never witnessed behavior like this. She had seen children become upset, cry, or struggle with frustration, but Tate's reactions seemed to consume him completely. To her, it looked like something far beyond an ordinary preschool meltdown. A troubling thought crossed her mind. Something is deeply wrong here, she wondered. She found herself wondering if Tate was emotionally disturbed, though she knew she wasn't qualified to determine what was happening. She had never had a student with seizures in her classroom before, if that was even what she had witnessed. She only knew that Tate seemed to become overwhelmed by emotions in a way she had never seen before. When Tate finally opened his eyes, he didn't look toward his parents. He looked for Joey. The moment he saw his uncle, Tate moved toward him, seeking the one person who seemed to make him feel safe. Joey opened his arms and Tate immediately crawled close, hiding against him as though he wanted to disappear from the room entirely. He tucked himself beneath Joey's shirt and rested his head against his uncle's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of Joey's heartbeat. Slowly Tate began to calm. The tension in his small body eased as he held onto Joey, using the familiar comfort of his uncle's presence to feel safe again. He stayed hidden there, avoiding his parents' worried looks. Talia and Terrence watched quietly, unsure what to do. Mrs. Johnson watched too, still unsettled by what she had seen. She cared about Tate, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was something much bigger than anything she had encountered in her classroom before. Mrs. Johnson stood quietly near the edge of the room, watching Tate cling to Joey as though the rest of the world had disappeared. She had worked with preschool children long enough to understand that every child was different. She had seen children cry when they missed their parents, scream when they were frustrated, and have moments where their emotions became too big for them to handle. She had learned that children often expressed fear and confusion in ways adults didn't always understand. But what she had witnessed with Tate felt different. She couldn't stop replaying the events in her mind. One moment he had seemed overwhelmed and frightened, and the next he had become completely consumed by his emotions. The intensity of his reaction had caught her off guard. She had never seen a child become so desperate for one specific person, so determined to hide away from everyone else. Mrs. Johnson glanced at Tate again. He was quiet now. Calm. Safe. But the contrast bothered her. How could the same child who had seemed so overwhelmed moments ago become so peaceful simply by being held by Joey? She didn't know what to make of it. Her years as a teacher had taught her patience, but they had also taught her to recognize when something was outside her experience. She had never had a student who reacted this way before. She had never had a student whose emotions seemed to take over so completely. A troubling thought slowly entered her mind. Is Tate disturbed? The word made her uncomfortable. She didn't like thinking of a child that way. Children were still growing, still learning. Still trying to make sense of the world around them. She knew that a child acting differently didn't mean she understood the reason behind it. But she couldn't deny what she had seen. The fear. The panic. The way Tate had pushed away from his father only to cling desperately to his uncle. Mrs. Johnson folded her arms, watching quietly. Maybe there was something beneath the surface that she couldn't see. Maybe Tate was struggling with something he didn't know how to express. Maybe there was a reason for his behavior that no one had discovered yet. Still, the question remained in her mind. Was Tate disturbed, or was he simply a child in distress who needed someone to understand him? She didn't know the answer. All she knew was that Tate was unlike any student she had ever taught, and she hoped the adults around him would figure out what he needed before his struggles became even harder for him to carry. Joey reached into his pocket and pulled out a small candy bar. He tapped Tate gently on the nose. "Look what I found," he said softly. Tate's eyes opened just enough to notice the treat. For the first time in what felt like forever, his expression changed. He reached out, took the candy from Joey's hand, and immediately placed it in his mouth. The small comfort seemed to help. After finishing the candy, Tate shifted closer again, resting his head against Joey's chest. He pressed his ear against him, listening carefully to the steady rhythm of his uncle's heartbeat. The sound calmed him. The room slowly became quiet. Minutes passed. Eventually, Tate's breathing slowed, his grip loosened, and he drifted off to sleep against Joey. His thumb slipped into his mouth as he settled into the familiar comfort of his uncle's arms. Mrs. Johnson watched the scene carefully. She cleared her throat. "Mr. and Mrs. Blue," she said quietly, "I need to talk to you about something." Talia and Terrence looked over. "I'm worried about your son," she continued. She glanced at Tate sleeping peacefully before choosing her words carefully. "I have a bachelor's degree in psychology, but I want to be very clear, I am not qualified to diagnose him. I've only known Tate for 10 days. She paused. "But I have seen some behaviors that concern me." Her voice softened. "I'm not saying your son is disturbed, that's not my place to say, but the way he reacts when he's overwhelmed, the intensity of his emotions and how quickly things escalate, I think something is going on that deserves attention." Terrence frowned slightly. "What are you suggesting?" "I think it might be worth having a doctor evaluate him," Mrs. Johnson said. "Not because there's something wrong with him as a person, but because he may need support that we don't know how to provide yet." The moment the word reached Tate's ears, his eyes opened. "Doctor." The single word changed everything. Tate sat up suddenly, fear replacing the calm expression he had moments before. "No." Joey immediately looked down at him. "Tate." But Tate was already overwhelmed. He scrambled away, crying out as panic took over. He pushed away from Joey's lap and began yelling, his fear turning into anger and frustration. "No, doctor." The adults tried to calm him, but Tate's emotions spiraled. He knocked toys aside, sending them across the room, and in his distress began throwing things and stomping his feet. The peaceful child who had been asleep moments before was gone, replaced by a frightened little boy who seemed convinced something terrible was about to happen. Joey moved carefully toward him. "Tate, look at me," he said gently. But Tate was too overwhelmed to listen. The room fell silent as everyone watched, realizing that whatever Tate was experiencing went far beyond a simple tantrum. The moment Tate heard the word doctor, something inside him snapped. For a few seconds, nobody moved. The little boy who had been peacefully curled against Joey only moments earlier suddenly looked terrified. His eyes widened, his breathing changed, and his entire body became tense as if he had heard something threatening rather than a word meant to help him. "No, doctor." Joey immediately reached toward him. "Tate, listen to me." But Tate couldn't hear him. The fear had already taken over. He scrambled away, pushing himself off Joey's lap and stumbling toward the play area. The adults watched in shock as his panic turned into a storm of emotion that he didn't seem able to control. Tate grabbed the nearest toys and threw them aside. The dollhouse pieces went flying first. Then the blocks. The carefully arranged preschool toys that had taken the children hours to build were suddenly scattered across the floor. Tate moved from one thing to the next, pulling items from shelves and knocking things over as though he needed the entire room to match the chaos he felt inside. Mrs. Johnson stood frozen. She had seen children cry. She had seen children yell. She had seen children become frustrated when they didn't get their way. But she had never witnessed anything like this. Tate wasn't simply upset. He looked completely overwhelmed, as if he had lost access to any other way of expressing what he was feeling. He knocked over containers of toys and swept items from tables. Anything within reach became another thing he pushed away. He moved through the room in a rush of fear and anger, leaving the play area in disarray. Books, toys, and classroom materials ended up scattered across the floor. A small bookcase tipped over, causing the room to erupt in startled gasps. "Tate," Talia cried. Joey stepped forward carefully, trying not to frighten him further. "Tate, I'm right here." But Tate continued, stomping and crying, unable to settle himself. The more the adults tried to reach him, the more trapped he seemed to feel. Mrs. Johnson watched in disbelief. She counted the damaged items afterward. Nearly 20 things had been knocked over, broken, or ruined during the outburst. She had never seen such an intense reaction from a child so young. Finally, after the storm of emotion had exhausted him, Tate's strength began to fade. He dropped down onto the floor. For a moment, he simply sat there surrounded by the mess, breathing heavily. Then the anger turned back into distress. He began kicking his feet against the floor and crying out, overwhelmed by feelings he couldn't explain. Joey lowered himself nearby, his expression full of concern. The room that had once been filled with toys and laughter was now completely silent except for Tate's cries. Everyone stood there realizing the same thing. Tate wasn't just having a difficult moment. Something deeper was happening, and they needed to understand it. The room was already in chaos, but what happened next left everyone completely still. Tate wandered through the scattered toys with a distant, overwhelmed expression. He picked up a toy shovel from the floor and then reached for one of the dolls that had been left near the play area. Mrs. Johnson immediately noticed. Something about the way Tate was holding the doll made her uneasy. "Tate," she said carefully, trying to keep her voice calm, "put that down, sweetheart." But Tate didn't seem to hear her. He focused entirely on the toy in his hands, acting out whatever storm was happening inside his own mind. He struck at the doll repeatedly with the toy shovel until the doll's head came loose. A sharp silence filled the room. Mrs. Johnson froze. She had worked with children for years. She understood imagination. She understood children pretending, playing, and exploring emotions through toys. But this felt different to her. She looked at the broken doll in Tate's hands, then at the little boy standing there with such intensity on his face. Her stomach tightened. Talia's expression changed immediately. "Tate," she whispered. There was no anger in her voice. Only fear. She took a small step forward, trying to reach her son without frightening him. "Baby, come here." But Tate didn't respond. He simply stared at the doll, almost as though he was still trapped in whatever emotion had taken over him. Mrs. Johnson exchanged a worried glance with Talia. The teacher, who had been trying to understand Tate, now felt even more uncertain. She had seen children express anger through toys before, but she had never seen a child become so disconnected from the room around him. She wondered what Tate was feeling. Was he scared? Was he angry? Was he trying to communicate something he couldn't put into words? She didn't know. Talia looked heartbroken. Watching her son struggle was painful in a way she couldn't explain. She wanted to scoop him up, tell him everything was okay, and make whatever fear was inside him disappear. But she also knew that rushing toward him when he was overwhelmed sometimes made things worse. So she stood there, fighting the instinct to immediately fix everything. Tate eventually walked toward the bathroom, still holding the doll. The adults followed carefully, unsure what he was going to do. When he dropped the doll into the toilet and flushed it, Mrs. Johnson covered her mouth in shock. The action wasn't just about the toy anymore. To her, it represented how completely overwhelmed Tate had become. "Oh my," she whispered. Talia looked away for a moment, visibly shaken. She had spent every day loving and protecting her son, but moments like this made her realize how much of Tate's inner world remained hidden from her. "Tate," she said softly, "why did you do that?" There was no answer. Instead, after the intensity of the moment passed, Tate's body seemed to finally give in to exhaustion. He lowered himself onto the floor. At first, everyone thought he had simply collapsed from being overwhelmed. "Tate," Talia called. But then she noticed something. He wasn't unconscious. He was lying completely still, pretending. Playing dead. Mrs. Johnson stared, unsure how to react. The behavior confused her even more than the outburst itself. One moment Tate had been overwhelmed with emotion, and the next he had created an entirely different scenario. Talia slowly approached her son and knelt beside him. Her voice softened. "Tate, I know you're there." For a few seconds he didn't move. Then his eyes flickered slightly. Talia sighed, a mixture of relief and sadness crossing her face. She gently brushed his hair back. Her little boy was still there. He just seemed lost inside emotions much bigger than he knew how to handle. Tate lay completely still on the floor. At first Talia's heart jumped. "Tate." She took a step forward, but then she noticed something unusual. His arms were positioned diagonally across his chest, almost like he was pretending to be a mummy in a game. His eyes were closed tightly, and he was holding his entire body still, clearly committed to the act. Mrs. Johnson stared. "He isn't unconscious," she said quietly. Talia looked down at her son, confusion and worry crossing her face. "No," she whispered, "he's playing." Mrs. Johnson nodded slowly. "He's pretending to be dead." The words made Talia uncomfortable. She knelt down beside Tate but didn't immediately touch him. "Tate," she said gently, "Mommy knows you're there." No response. He remained frozen, his arms still crossed diagonally over his body, as though he were a character in one of his imaginary games. Mrs. Johnson watched carefully. "I've seen children pretend to be superheroes, animals, or characters from stories," she said softly, "but this is different from anything I've seen before." Talia looked at her son. "He does things like this when he's overwhelmed," she admitted quietly. "Sometimes he disappears into his own little world." Mrs. Johnson nodded, still studying Tate. "The interesting thing is that he chose this," she said. "He went from being extremely upset to creating a situation where he has complete control. He's deciding when he moves, when he responds, when the moment ends." Talia's expression softened with sadness. "He's just a little boy," she said. "I know," Mrs. Johnson replied. "And that's why I'm concerned, not because he's a bad child, not because he's trying to be difficult, but because he seems to be struggling with emotions that are much bigger than what he knows how to handle." Talia looked back down at Tate. His small hands remained still. His face was serious, as if he truly believed he had disappeared from the world. "Tate," she whispered, "you don't have to hide from us." For several seconds he didn't move. Then one tiny finger twitched. Mrs. Johnson noticed. "He heard you." Talia smiled sadly. "I know my son is still in there." Mrs. Johnson watched as Tate continued his pretend game, his little arms still positioned like a mummy. "I've only known him for 10 days, she said carefully, "but I can tell he feels things very deeply." Talia nodded, brushing a strand of hair away from Tate's forehead. Yes, she whispered, he always has. Joey watched the room for a moment, noticing the tension hanging over everyone. Why don't I take him outside, he offered, you all can talk amongst yourselves. Talia looked relieved by the suggestion and nodded. That might be a good idea. Joey crouched down beside Tate, who was still lying perfectly still on the floor, committed to his little game. All right, little nephew, Joey said with a playful smile. How about we go outside and do something more interesting? Tate didn't move. Joey shook his head with an amused grin. Seriously, you're still a mummy. He gently scooped Tate up into his arms. Come on, let's go dig a hole in the backyard, huh? That got a tiny reaction. Maybe we'll find some worms, Joey continued. Or some bugs, who knows, maybe we'll discover something amazing. Tate remained quiet, but he allowed himself to be carried. Joey looked down at him and laughed softly. I have the weirdest nephew. He said it with affection, not criticism. Tate's serious expression finally cracked just a little. Joey carried him through the house and toward the backyard, leaving Talia, Terrence, and Mrs. Johnson behind to have the difficult conversation they needed to have. Outside, the fresh air and familiar routine offered Tate something the room inside couldn't, space to calm down and a chance to simply be a little boy again. I'm worried about him, Mrs. Johnson said quietly once Joey had taken Tate outside. She glanced toward the backyard window, her expression still troubled. His behavior is alarming. I've never seen a child respond quite like that before. Does he always do this? Talia let out a slow breath. She looked toward the window where she could see Joey walking with Tate outside. Yes and no, she admitted. Mrs. Johnson turned back toward her. What do you mean? Talia folded her hands together. Tate has always been dramatic, very dramatic, she said with a small, almost tired smile. He has a flair for the macabre, the morbid. He likes pretending to be things that are a little unusual. Mrs. Johnson listened carefully. He's played dead several times, Talia continued. It's just the way he plays. Other children pretend to be superheroes or animals. Tate pretends to be ghosts, mummies, or characters who have disappeared. She paused. He's always had a very intense imagination. Mrs. Johnson nodded slowly but still looked concerned. I understand imagination, she said. I just want to make sure we're not overlooking something. I know, Talia replied, and I appreciate that you care about him. She looked back outside. Tate has always felt things differently. He gets attached. He gets overwhelmed. He can be incredibly affectionate one moment and completely lost in his emotions the next. Mrs. Johnson watched as Joey knelt beside Tate in the backyard. I just want to make sure he's okay, she said. Talia nodded. So do I. After the meeting was over, Talia stepped outside to collect Tate from the backyard. She expected to find him and Joey digging in the dirt, probably covered in mud and proudly showing off whatever they had discovered. Instead, she stopped in her tracks. A large hole had been dug into the ground. For a moment she simply stared. Then she saw Joey. He was kneeling at the edge of the hole, looking both amused and concerned as he tried to coax Tate out. Tate, come on, little nephew, Joey said. The mummy game is over. Talia's eyes widened. Because lying at the bottom of the hole was Tate. Completely still. Arms positioned across himself. Playing dead. Her heart dropped. What are you doing? Both Joey and Tate looked up. Joey immediately recognized the expression on Talia's face. Talia. But she was already moving. The image was too much for her. Her son had spent the day overwhelmed, had frightened everyone with his emotions, and now he had dug a hole in the backyard just to lie in it pretending he was gone. She carefully climbed down into the hole and reached for him. Tate. He opened his eyes, surprised that the game had been interrupted. Talia pulled him into her arms. Don't do that to Mommy, she whispered, her voice shaking with emotion. Tate looked confused. But I was playing. Talia held him close, trying to calm herself. I know you were playing, sweetheart, I know. Joey climbed down beside them, his expression gentler. He wanted to be a buried mummy, Joey explained. I was trying to convince him that worms and bugs were more interesting. Talia looked between the two of them, still trying to process what she had walked into. Only Tate could turn an afternoon of digging for worms into an elaborate dramatic performance. She hugged him tighter. "You're going to give me gray hair before I'm ready," she whispered. Tate simply rested against her, completely unaware of how alarming the scene had looked to everyone else. To him, it had only been another game. Joey looked angry. Talia noticed it immediately as she guided Tate back toward the car. Something about the way he carried himself made her pause. Joey was usually the steady one, the person who kept everyone calm when emotions ran high. Seeing him this upset was unsettling. She helped Tate into the backseat and glanced back toward the preschool. Joey wasn't coming with them yet. Instead, he had walked over to Terrence. The two brothers stood away from the car, speaking in voices too quiet for Talia to hear. At first, it seemed like a private conversation, but it quickly became clear that whatever they were discussing had struck a nerve. Joey's frustration grew. He waved his arms as he spoke, his emotions visible in every movement. He gestured toward the car where Talia and Tate were waiting, clearly referring to what had happened inside the preschool. Terrence remained serious, listening but pushing back when he disagreed. The tension between the brothers continued to build until the argument crossed a line. Joey stepped forward in anger, and the confrontation became physical as Joey's hands wrapped around his brother's throat. For a brief moment, the fight worried Talia before Terrence pulled away, creating distance between them. Terrence looked shocked and disappointed. "Joey," he said firmly. But Joey was still overwhelmed with frustration, packing and continuing to gesture as he tried to make his point. From the car, Talia watched anxiously. She couldn't hear the words, but she could see enough to know that something deeper was being argued about. A few minutes later, Terrence finally walked back toward the vehicle. He got into the car without saying much. Joey followed and sat in the backseat beside Tate. The contrast was striking. Tate, unaware of the tension between the adults, simply leaned against his uncle, calm and comfortable after the emotional day he had experienced. Terrence, however, stayed quiet throughout the drive home. He wasn't in a good mood. His hands remained firmly on the steering wheel, and his responses were short whenever Talia tried to speak with him. The silence stretched until Joey finally broke it. "I got a distressing call from one of my businesses," he explained. "There was an issue I needed to resolve with Terrence." Talia looked toward him through the mirror. The explanation answered what they had been talking about, but it didn't explain the intensity of the argument. Something had clearly been said between the brothers, something that had left both of them unsettled. In the backseat, Tate resisted getting settled, twisting away when it was time for his seatbelt. His breathing picked up, his hands fidgeting restlessly as he tried to delay being secured in place. "Tate," Talia said gently from the front passenger seat, turning around. "Seatbelt first, then we can go home." He shook his head, pulling back slightly. "No." Terrence let out a tired breath from the driver's seat. "Tate, we are not starting this again, put your seatbelt on." Talia held up a hand slightly toward Terrence, signaling for a calmer approach. "Let me try." She turned more fully in her seat. "Hey, I know today was a lot, but you need your seatbelt so we can drive safely. I'll help you if you want." Tate hesitated, still tense, but didn't fully resist when she reached for the strap. His movements were quick and restless, but not fighting her, more like he couldn't quite settle his body long enough to cooperate easily. "It's okay," she said softly as she clicked it into place. "You're safe, we're just going home." Tate shifted in the seat, still upset, but the physical restraint of the belt seemed to slow him down a little. He stared out the window, jaw tight, hands gripping the edge of his seat. Terrence started the car after a moment of silence. "We're not going to keep having this kind of day," he said more quietly now, less sharp. "We'll figure something out." Talia glanced back at Tate again. "We'll talk more when we get home, okay? No more meetings today." Tate didn't answer, still wound tight from the afternoon, but the motion of the car and the quieter voices began to steady him slightly as they drove away from the school. And as the car continued down the road, the weight of the afternoon followed them home. When they got home, the tension from the day followed them into the dining room. Talia and Terrence sat Tate down at the table so they could talk through what had been happening, trying to keep their voices calm and steady. Tate, Terrence began carefully, we've been thinking about school and how hard things have been with transitions. Tate immediately tensed, sensing where the conversation was going. I think, Terrence continued, choosing his words, it might help if we start giving you a little more space during the week. Maybe fewer days where things feel so overwhelming. Tate shook his head quickly, no. Talia leaned forward slightly, soft but firm. We're not taking anything away from you, we're trying to help you feel better at school. I don't need help, Tate said, voice rising a little. I need Noah. Terrence sighed gently. We understand that you really care about him, but part of growing up is also learning how to be okay when someone isn't right next to you all the time. Tate's face tightened. It's that teacher, he said suddenly. She's making you do this, she doesn't like me. No, Talia said immediately, reaching out to smooth his hair. This isn't about her not liking you, this is about helping you handle big feelings. Tate pulled slightly away, upset. You're taking him away from me. We are not taking Noah away from you, Terrence said firmly but calmly. No one is doing that. Talia nodded. Noah is still your buddy, that doesn't change, but we might need to practice some time apart so preschool doesn't feel so hard. Tate pushed his chair back slightly, frustrated, breathing unevenly. I don't want time apart. I know, Talia said softly, it feels really hard right now. Tate hesitated, then stood up and moved closer, wrapping his arms around Talia's side instead of sitting still at the table. He clung tightly, grounding himself in the contact while the conversation continued around him. Terrence watched him for a moment, then softened his tone. Tate, you're supposed to sit in your chair for dinner talk, okay? I don't want to, Tate muttered, still holding on. Talia gently rested a hand on his back. Okay, she said quietly, we can slow down for a minute. The room felt quieter as they paused the discussion, focusing instead on helping Tate settle after a very long and overwhelming day, rather than pushing the conversation further while he was still so emotionally activated. After the meeting, the school implemented a temporary change. Tate was placed in a different kindergarten classroom to reduce disruption and help him adjust to structured separation from Noah. At first, it seemed manageable, but by mid-morning on the first day, Mrs. Johnson realized Tate wasn't where he was supposed to be. Mrs. Johnson checked the hallway first. No Tate. She walked toward the restroom area, scanning the line and the nearby corners where children sometimes wandered when they were distracted. Nothing. Next, she searched the reading corner, looking behind the shelves and around the small chairs where children often curled up with their favorite books. Still no Tate. Her concern grew as she continued through the preschool rooms, calling his name softly. Tate. Finally, she reached Mrs. Engstrom's classroom. She stopped in the doorway. Noah was there. And so was Tate. The sight caught her completely off guard. Tate was sitting behind Noah with Noah settled on Tate's small lap, the little boy quietly holding onto the familiar presence in front of him. There was no crying, no panic, no struggle. Just quiet. It looked as though Tate had simply followed a routine that made sense to him: find Noah, stay close, and feel safe. Noah sat there patiently, almost as surprised by the situation as anyone else, while Tate remained calm and content. Mrs. Engstrom looked up from her desk, her eyebrows lifting in surprise. Oh, she said softly, I didn't realize they were in here. The person searching for Tate had expected to find another crisis. Instead, she found a child who had quietly removed himself from the noise of the day and sought out the person who made him feel most comfortable. For a moment nobody spoke. The contrast was striking. The same child who had caused so much concern earlier was now completely peaceful, sitting in a quiet classroom as though this was exactly where he belonged. Tate just walked in and sat down, Mrs. Engstrom said carefully. He said he didn't want to be in the other room. Mrs. Johnson took a slow breath. He was supposed to remain in my class today. Talia arrived shortly after, called by the office. Tate, she said gently, kneeling to his level, you're not supposed to switch classrooms without asking. Tate looked down. I just wanted Noah. Noah glanced between the adults, uncertain. He just came in, I didn't tell him to. Mrs. Engstrom exchanged a look with Mrs. Johnson. It's the third time this week he's attempted to relocate himself during instructional time. Mrs. Johnson nodded. We need a more structured plan. Separation without supervision isn't working. Terrence, who had been brought in for a follow-up meeting later that day, listened carefully as the staff explained. So he's actively seeking proximity to one peer even when redirected, he said. Yes, Mrs. Johnson replied, it's consistent and it disrupts both classrooms. Talia looked toward Tate. Sweetheart, you can't move between rooms like that, it's not safe and it makes it hard for everyone to learn. Tate frowned, but I don't like being alone. We understand that, Terrence said more gently. But school has boundaries. We need to help you stay in your classroom and still feel okay even when Noah isn't there. Over the next few days, the same pattern repeated in smaller ways, Tate asking to go to the bathroom and detouring toward Noah's room, lingering at transitions, or trying to sit near the shared spaces where he thought he might see him. Each time, staff redirected him back with increasing structure and consistency. At the next coordination meeting, Mrs. Johnson spoke plainly. We need a consistent separation plan, she said, predictable routines, clear visuals, and a staff member assigned to help him transition between activities so he doesn't feel the need to search for Noah. Mrs. Engstrom agreed. Tate isn't trying to disrupt on purpose, he's trying to regulate, but right now he doesn't have the tools to do it independently. Talia sighed softly. So, we're not removing Noah from his life, we're teaching him how to function when Noah isn't the anchor in his room. Terrence nodded. Exactly, gradual independence, not abrupt separation. Across the room, Tate sat quietly at a small table with crayons, listening in fragments. He still didn't fully like what was happening, but the frantic urgency to find Noah every minute had started to soften into something more tired, more uncertain, like he was beginning to realize that school was still there, even when he wasn't next to him. Talia decided they needed help from someone Tate already felt safe with. That's when she called Uncle Joey. He flew in from Prague that weekend, arriving quietly in the afternoon and stepping into a household that had been tense for days. Tate noticed him immediately. Joey, Tate said, surprised, pausing in the hallway. Joey smiled gently. Hey, buddy. Tate hesitated only a second before moving closer, his usual restlessness softening a little. Joey crouched down to his level without rushing him. Talia exhaled in relief. I just thought it might help if someone he trusts could talk to him without it feeling like school or rules all the time. Terrence nodded, someone neutral, not a teacher, not part of the conflict. Later, in the living room, Joey sat with Tate on the floor while he played with a set of small blocks. He didn't interrupt the play right away, just observed, calm and steady. You've been having a pretty big week, huh? Joey said after a while. Tate shrugged, stacking a block then knocking it down. School is stupid. Joey gave a small nod, not reacting strongly. Sounds like it's been really hard at school. Tate glanced up briefly then back down. They keep separating me. Talia, sitting nearby, listened quietly but didn't interrupt. Joey spoke gently, separating you from Noah. Tate nodded quickly. Yeah, I don't like it. Joey leaned back slightly on his hands. It makes sense that you'd feel upset about that. When you're used to being with someone, it can feel weird when that changes. Tate shifted quieter now. It feels bad. I believe you, Joey said simply. Terrence crossed his arms loosely, watching the exchange. We're trying to help him learn to feel okay even when Noah isn't right next to him. Joey nodded. That's a big skill for a kid, not easy. Talia added softly, at school it's starting to affect how he handles transitions. Joey looked at Tate again, not pressing, just present. Tate, I don't think anyone is trying to take Noah away from you. Tate frowned. It feels like they are. I know, Joey said, but feelings and facts can be different. What we're trying to do is make school feel safe even when things change a little. Tate was quiet for a moment, then stacked another block more slowly. I don't want it to change. Joey nodded. Yeah, you want things to stay the same, that makes sense. A pause settled over the room. Then Joey added, what if we practiced small times of being okay without having to be right next to him all the time? Not forever, just a little at a time, so your brain doesn't feel so overwhelmed at school. Tate didn't answer immediately, but he didn't reject it either. He just kept stacking blocks, slower now, listening in his own way. Talia exchanged a look with Terrence, less about control and more about whether they were finally finding a way forward that didn't feel like constant conflict. And for the first time in days, Tate stayed in the room without escalating, simply listening to the adults talk while Joey sat beside him, steady and familiar, like an anchor that didn't demand anything from him. Joey took Tate's hand gently as they stepped toward the door. "Why don't we go out for ice cream? I'll bike us there," he said with a small smile. "We can talk some more and I've got you a present too." Tate paused mid-step. "A present?" Joey nodded. "Yeah, something I found during my school days in Prague. I thought you might like it, maybe even show it in class when you're back." Tate's expression softened a little, curiosity breaking through the tension from earlier. He pulled his coat on quickly, still watching Joey. "What is it?" "You'll see," Joey said lightly. "It's in the bag." Talia stood by the doorway, observing the shift in Tate's mood with cautious relief. Terrence leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching but not interrupting. "We'll be back in a few hours," Joey said to Talia. "I've got my phone if you need me." "Thank you," Talia replied. "Just keep him settled, it's been a long week." Joey gave a reassuring nod. "I've got him." Tate hesitated at the threshold, then glanced back inside. "Can I bring Noah?" Joey's expression softened immediately, but he shook his head gently. "Not this time, just us okay guys time." Tate frowned. "But I want Noah." "I know," Joey said calmly, crouching slightly to his level. "And you can see him at school, but right now this is our time together." Tate shifted on his feet, visibly unsure. "He'll be mad if I'm gone." "Noah will be okay," Joey assured him. "And so will you. Let's go get ice cream first, then we'll talk about everything else." Tate was quiet for a moment, then gave a small reluctant nod. As they walked out to Joey's bike, Talia watched from the doorway. "Call me when you're there," she said. "I will," Joey replied. Tate sat in the passenger seat behind Joey, who pedaled his bike into town. After a while he spoke again, softer this time. "Are you really gonna give me something from Prague?" Joey smiled. "Yeah, it's something small but special." Tate nodded slowly. "Okay." Then after a pause, almost quieter than before, "I still want Noah though." Joey didn't dismiss it, he just kept his tone steady. "I know you do, and it's okay to miss him, but we can still have a good time today even while you miss him." Tate didn't answer right away, just watched the buildings pass by. "Okay," he finally said. Joey glanced at him briefly. "That's all we're doing today, ice cream, a gift and talking, no pressure." Tate leaned back in his bike seat a little, still thinking about Noah but no longer escalating, just quietly holding onto the idea that maybe for a little while he could do both, miss him and still be okay. Uncle Joey was 14 and attending school away from Los Angeles. Over the years he naturally became especially close with Tate. Out of all the relatives, Tate seemed to gravitate toward him the most, and Joey understood him in a calm, steady way that made transitions easier when things got overwhelming. On weekends when Joey came into California, he often spent time with Tate, taking him out for simple things, bike rides, ice cream, and small trips to shops where Tate could look around without pressure. Joey was patient with his emotions and helped him settle when he got overwhelmed, not by controlling him, but by slowing things down and talking him through it. That afternoon, they were gone for a few hours, and when they finally returned home, Tate was already asleep in the backseat of Joey's bike, completely worn out. Joey carefully carried him inside and laid him down on the couch with a blanket before joining Talia and Terrence in the kitchen. "He had a rough moment earlier," Joey said quietly. "He got really upset about Noah not being there, started panicking a bit, but I brought him out of it." Talia looked up immediately, concerned. "A panic attack?" she asked. Joey nodded gently. "Yeah, but we kept it simple. I just got him to breathe with me, gave him something small to focus on. He actually calmed down with a peppermint stick I had in my pocket. Nothing dramatic, just grounding." Terrence exhaled slowly. "He's been like that more often lately," he admitted. "It's the separation from Noah, it sets him off faster than anything else." Joey leaned against the counter. "I don't think it's about control or defiance, it's more like he doesn't know how to reset when he feels disconnected from him." Talia crossed her arms, thinking. We're trying to build that skill at school, but it keeps escalating before he can get there. Joey nodded again. That's why the short trips help today. It gives him something predictable that isn't tied to school pressure. Terrence glanced toward the living room where Tate was sleeping. Is he okay now? Joey softened his voice. Yeah, he's exhausted. Once he came down from it, he just kind of shut off and fell asleep on the backseat of my bike. Talia sighed, a mix of relief and worry. He's been doing that a lot after emotional spikes. Joey looked between them. He's not trying to be difficult, he just gets overwhelmed really fast when something important to him feels out of reach. Terrence nodded slowly. So the question is how we teach him to tolerate that without shutting down or escalating. Joey straightened slightly. Exactly, and I think consistency is going to matter more than intensity. Same message every time but delivered calmly. Talia glanced again toward Tate, sleeping deeply on the couch. He's going to wake up and ask for Noah, she said quietly. Joey nodded. I know, and we'll just have to walk him through it again the same way we did today. Joey stayed by the couch for a moment longer, watching Tate sleep. He crouched slightly and gave a small, soft smile. Hey, kid, he said quietly, warm and affectionate, careful not to wake him. You made it through a long day. Tate didn't respond, still deeply asleep, his breathing slow and even. Joey straightened a little and glanced back toward Talia and Terrence. He's really out. Talia nodded softly. He's been running on empty since this morning. Joey leaned in again and gently adjusted the blanket over Tate's shoulders. Hey, kid, he murmured again under his breath, almost like a reassurance more than a call. You did good today. Terrence watched from the counter. He responds to you differently than he does to us. Joey gave a small shrug. I think I'm less structured with him. I'm not asking him to perform or behave a certain way all the time. That probably makes things feel safer. Talia leaned against the doorway. We're trying to figure out how to bring that feeling into school without everything falling apart when he gets overwhelmed. Joey nodded. Yeah, once he gets overloaded, his brain just locks onto Noah as the thing that makes everything feel okay. That's the pattern we're trying to broaden. Tate shifted slightly in his sleep. Noah. Joey glanced down, then back up. Even asleep, that's still where his mind goes first. Talia's expression softened. He's really holding onto that connection. Joey nodded again. Right now he is, but kids can build new coping pathways. It just takes time, repetition, and not overwhelming him while he learns it. Terrence exhaled slowly. So, consistency, structure, and calm support. Exactly, Joey said. No big pressure moments, just steady steps. He looked down at Tate one last time, his voice soft again. Hey kid, you're okay. Then he stepped back, letting the room settle into quiet again while Tate continued sleeping peacefully on the couch. Joey smiled softly as he looked over at Tate. He was really upset earlier, Joey explained. So upset that the anxiety made his stomach hurt and he ended up getting sick. He glanced down at his nephew, who now seemed calm and comfortable. But he's okay now. Joey's expression softened. Sometimes he just gets overwhelmed, and it takes him a while to come back down. He looked toward Talia and Terrence. Next week, when Uncle Tim comes by, maybe he could spend some time with Tate. Joey smiled. They seemed to get along pretty well. Talia looked over at Tate, who was once again peaceful after such a difficult day. It was hard to believe how quickly things could change with him. One moment he could be overwhelmed by emotions too big for him to handle, and the next he could be quietly sitting with someone he trusted, completely content. Joey gave Tate a gentle pat on the shoulder. He just needs people who understand him. Over the next few days, Tate came down with what the family assumed was a stomach bug. He stayed on the couch most of the time, pale and quiet, not interested in playing or even sitting up for long. His usual energy was gone, replaced with fatigue and irritability whenever he tried to eat. Talia sat beside him, gently smoothing his hair back. You need to keep sipping water, okay? Just small sips. Tate frowned weakly. I don't feel good. I know, she said softly. We're just trying to help your body feel better. Joey sat nearby, keeping a steady presence, occasionally offering water in a cup with a straw. Hey, kid, he said gently, just a little bit, you don't have to rush. Tate took a sip, then leaned back against the couch again. Terrence stood near the kitchen, watching with concern. He's been like this since yesterday, he's not really keeping anything down. Talia nodded. If it doesn't improve soon, we may need to call the pediatrician, Dr. Robert Bennett again. From the armchair nearby, Noah sat quietly with a book in his hands. He glanced up often, clearly worried. I can read to him, Noah asked softly. Maybe it'll help him feel better. Talia gave a small, tired smile. You can try. Noah carefully scooted closer and began reading in a quiet voice, slow and steady. He wasn't sure if it would help, but he kept going anyway. Tate didn't fully respond, but his eyes drifted toward Noah's voice, listening even if he didn't speak. Joey leaned toward Talia, lowering his voice. He's really wiped out. Talia sighed. It's been a rough few days. Between school stress and now this, his system just feels overloaded. Terrence crossed his arms. At least he's not fighting us today, he just can't do much. Joey nodded. Yeah, sometimes his body just shuts everything else down when it gets overwhelmed. Noah looked up from his book again. Should I keep reading? Talia glanced at Tate, then nodded. Yeah, just softly. Noah continued reading, a little more confident now, while Tate lay back on the couch, eyes half closed, still listening even through the discomfort. Joey spoke quietly to Talia and Terrence. We just keep it calm, hydration, rest, and no pressure. Terrence nodded, and if it doesn't improve, we call the doctor again. Talia watched Tate for a moment longer. Right now, he just needs to get through it. And the room stayed quiet, filled only with Noah's soft reading and the steady presence of the family keeping watch over him as he rested. Tate had a rough couple of days as the stomach illness ran its course. The first day was the hardest. He could barely keep anything down and mostly stayed curled up on the couch, exhausted and quiet. Talia kept a close eye on him, making sure he was staying hydrated and resting as much as possible. Joey stayed nearby too, gently encouraging small sips of water throughout the day and keeping things calm so Tate wouldn't get overwhelmed. It'll pass, Joey said softly at one point, watching Tate rest. He just needs time and fluids. Talia nodded. He's already a little better than yesterday, at least he's keeping some water down now. Terrence stood nearby, arms crossed but relaxed. Once the stomach part clears, the fatigue usually lingers a bit. By the second day, Tate still wasn't fully himself, but the worst of it had started to ease. He lay on the couch wrapped in a blanket, quieter than usual but no longer as distressed. Noah stayed close by, sitting in the armchair with a book. I can read more if he wants, Noah offered gently. Talia smiled faintly. That might be good, keep it calm. Noah nodded and carefully began reading from a simplified, child-friendly version of Great Expectations. His voice was steady and soft, filling the room without pressure. Tate didn't say anything, but his eyes stayed open, occasionally drifting toward Noah as he listened. Joey watched the scene for a moment and gave a small approving nod. That's good for him, familiar voice, calm pace. Talia exhaled slowly. He's finally starting to settle. Terrence glanced over. He's still weak, but at least he's not fighting it anymore. Noah kept reading, turning the pages carefully. Should I keep going? Talia nodded. Yeah, if he's listening, just keep going. Tate shifted slightly on the couch, pulling the blanket closer, still quiet but calmer than before. And for the first time in days, the house felt less tense, filled instead with soft reading, quiet conversation, and the slow return of energy as Tate began to recover. Dr. Bennett arrived the next afternoon around 4 o'clock. Talia had gone out shopping, leaving Terrence at home waiting for the doctor's arrival.